Hi everyone. Welcome to See the Invisible, Living with an Invisible or Rare Disease. My name is Rhonda Franny Jefferson, and thank you for taking some time out of your day to listen. If you've previously listened to the podcast, welcome back. If you're new, welcome, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to share some of my experiences. I hope that you get some positivity and some encouragement from the podcast. I hope that we can try to build a community that supports each other. The community of people that are impacted by an invisible illness is very vast and diverse. And within that community, I also include our loved ones as they're impacted and they're our biggest support system. So this podcast is really here to try to advocate for everyone who's impacted by an invisible illness or disease. I have been diagnosed with my illness for about 7.5 years, getting very close to 8. And prior to that, I had gone a number of years without a diagnosis, and my symptoms were slowly getting worse. And occasionally I would have periods of time where the symptoms were very severe. So now I know that was a flare-up. But especially over this past year with COVID-19 and the reaction that some people have had to the restrictions, I started to feel a lot of negativity. So what I wanted to do was I wanted to have a space where I could try to express myself and my feelings, to also then let other people know that there are other people who are experiencing similar things. I also know that everybody has different experiences in their lives and different situations. So I also want to recognize and respect that each one of us has a different story, and that we should all be here to recognize each other. Before I get started with the specifics today of this episode, I do always like to say that I am not a medical, insurance, or legal expert. If you do have any questions in those fields, please make sure that you're reaching out to the appropriate person so that you get the best information. To summarize some of the things that we've gone over previously that will be mentioned in this episode, we have gone over ways that we can try to be our own best advocate, including keeping track of your medical records, having open lines of communications with your doctors and other medical team members that you may have, as well as the importance of self-care. Last week, I went over an article from a website called cfsunraveled.com, and the title of the article was Invisible Illness: 7 Ways to Get Past the Injustices and Challenges. Now, this particular article mentioned a few different invisible illnesses particularly, but I really think there was a lot of good information that most of us can empathize with and understand, that we usually encounter on a weekly, if not daily basis. So parts of the article that we had reviewed, stated that having an invisible illness can be exhausting to explain and can also lead to negative emotions. Our physical, mental, and emotional health is all interconnected, and having an invisible illness can lead to, not necessarily taking the right care of yourself, which can lead to more negative feelings, and it's just a cycle where everything works hand in hand. We also looked at some misconceptions that a lot of people have about those with an invisible illness, such as the illness itself is not real, that just sometimes taking a nap in the afternoon or resting will make everything okay. And looking at the individual and someone thinking that we look fine, or this reminded me of a meme that I saw some years ago, and I don't remember the exact wording. I mentioned it previously, but when someone uses the term acting, like, well, you're acting okay, or you're acting fine, that's the point in the fact that we're acting, that we put on a brave face every day and really try to portray to the world that everything is fine. And then lastly, and where we left off, was tackling the idea that those with an invisible or chronic illness, especially if it does include chronic pain, that we're just looking for a doctor who might prescribe medications to us. I know myself, I find that particular topic uncomfortable, but I'm sure many of us have heard that before, especially if we went through a long period of time before we were diagnosed. So, as we progress and start encountering different and more obstacles in our daily life, there are usually some certain patterns that we often see. And one is that cycle effect that I've mentioned previously, in that a lot of times we feel stress. I know personally that at the beginning of my illness, when I was diagnosed, I actually felt so relieved to have a word, a diagnosis to say this is what I have, that sometimes I tended to over explain because I wanted to combat any negative thoughts that someone was having against me. But that actually just led to more anxiety and stress because I always wondered, did I miss something? Did I explain it appropriately? Things like that. And, I got to the point where I realized I just need to try to evaluate, do I really need to go into that? But one of the repercussions of that during the earlier time period, just after my diagnosis, was a lot of anxiety. And anxiety could lead to flare-ups of my illness, which then just leads to more negative emotions, having that impact my mental health, and so forth. So we really have to be able to recognize that each part of ourselves impacts another part of ourselves, and not to ignore any parts of that. Now, I did mention the anxiety, and that is one of the most common ways that, we tend to express ourselves with having this invisible illness. There have been times where I would joke around and say, oh, I'm a constant worrier, or I worry all the time. But it wasn't really a joke, because it was something that I thought about all the time with everything, not just dealing with my illness. It started to, kind of trickle into other parts of my life until I felt like I was anxious all the time. Whereas for me, having a name and diagnosis helped me in some ways alleviate a little bit of anxiety. It did, in other forms, create more anxiety. And when it is a rare illness, and especially one that others can't see, then that creates its own level of anxiety and worry. Sometimes, I would think about, well, if someone hears that I have this illness, they're going to think that I can't do my job or that I'm incompetent. For some people I know who may not be in a relationship or are starting a relationship, they may worry about how it's going to be impacted. I was very lucky in that my husband is very supportive. So we weren't married at the time, but he still would use the phrase "in sickness and in health." We were together quite a long time before we married. So he always made it known that he was going to be there for me. But yes, there are times that anxiety creeps back in, that, does he really have to be here? Will he stay with me? And he always assures me that he will. But, these are things that, most people have to deal with or occasionally think about. But when you have a chronic and rare illness, especially, it kind of takes on a life of its own at times. And having this anxiety in our lives can help lead to other things, such as not wanting to go to, different functions. I know that I would worry about if I'd be able to keep up with everybody. I have mobility issues that are associated with my illness. And I just wondered, okay, will I be able to do this with my family? Or even things such as, would I be even able to get up the stairs in a certain house? So those are things that are always in my mind. And at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, I would have to say that my anxiety was at an all-time high. We do have to take precautions. We do know that if you have an underlying condition, that it can impact those people, myself included, in a much more aggressive and severe way. So, just the isolation and loneliness that we feel can lead to the anxiety. So some of the things that individually we can try to do to fight the anxiety or depression that's associated with our illness is make sure that that we have a medical team. Each of us may have different types of specialists that we have to see. So make sure that you feel assured and confident in all of your healthcare providers. And myself, I've also benefited from speaking with a counselor. A lot of my sessions are done over the phone, so it's also very easy, or easier now than it used to be able to have those sessions instead of going in and waiting, depending on where the counselor was, going to their office. So it really makes it convenient for both the patient and the therapist. So, again, everybody's different, but I know that for me, it did help. It's also important to make sure you have a team itself so that everybody knows what the other person is doing. So if you're seeing one specialist, they're not prescribing or doing something that counteracts what another doctor is doing. So just knowing that you have that team available can help ease your mind or any concerns that you have. We should try to find things that we like to do that help us escape for a little while from our illness and how it impacts our lives. So whether it's times of meditation, reading, doing an activity that doesn't aggravate your illness in any way, those allow us to kind of escape for a little while and refresh ourselves during the day. And we also want to recognize when we feel certain negative thoughts coming in to our minds, and working with a counselor on ways to recognize negative thoughts and how you as an individual can best combat them can lead to having a more positive outlook. I feel that also the way I've approached things in the past and what I'm trying to change is trying to recognize any of the successes or achievements that I've done. I am very hard on myself, and if I did 99 things right and made one mistake, I wouldn't focus on the 99 right. I would focus on the one. So I want to, throughout the day, try to recognize what I've done and accomplished, and even doing something such as this podcast or writing on a blog or something like that makes me feel that I have accomplished something. Also overcoming in some ways my fear of making mistakes when I speak, because that's very hard for me. I've always worked in a position where I had to speak with people, whether it was face to face or over the phone. It wasn't a position where I was typing or doing other work where people wouldn't necessarily hear me. Sometimes there was a mix, but there was a lot of phone work in there. So I've always been extremely concerned about making mistakes when I speak. And as I started this podcast, I found myself many times going back and starting all over for one or two mistakes. But now I'm trying to move past that. So just recognizing the things that we do and what we do well will also lead to a positive outlook on life. And I've mentioned our support system and how it's important to recognize what they do. I know that with having a rare illness, I don't really have anybody that I can reach out to personally, but there are some online groups through Facebook that I can go into and know that if I ask a question, there's probably someone in there who's gone through the same thing. And I know that what they're providing me is not medical device, but it helps assure me that, okay, yes, this is something I have to see my specialist about, because sometimes it is hard to discern, okay, is this something new or could this be part of the illness? So it's really important to have that support so you understand what your next step should be in case you encounter new obstacles or challenges. So, keeping with recognizing when we need to see our doctor, when symptoms arise or something is new. A lot of times, if we've experienced negativity from people, especially prior to having a diagnosis, we may be less likely to see the doctor. I know there were many of times that I would think, okay, do I need to go to my doctor? Should I go to the ER? Prior to my diagnosis, there weren't that many immediate care centers open. So, I would always have this debate going inside my mind, like, okay, I need to see someone, but where should I go? What will they think if I see the same doctor in the ER that I saw last time I was there? And even when it would be my primary care physician that sent me to the hospital, even when she called over for me, I felt like when I got there that I wouldn't be believed. And that did happen actually quite a few times, and it was very frustrating. I understand that from a medical standpoint, they were running the normal battery of tests, and I know that they ran dozens, if not hundreds, of tests over the course of years to try to figure out what was going on. And so, yes, there were times where probably I should have called my doctor, but, I felt like if I went in there, they really weren't going to find anything. This is where, having a diagnosis and a name finally given to what I had was empowering, but that in its own self can create other challenges that we have to overcome. Sometimes doctors themselves question an invisible illness since they can't see it. So that's something that we face on a regular basis as well. Now, I know I've also mentioned the importance of having a good support system with your family and friends. And it's also important to recognize what we need to do for them. What I mean by that is, the person who is there with us most of the time, so in my case, my husband, he doesn't know necessarily what it's like to go through the experiences that I do. I need to make sure that I communicate fully with him so that he understands what I'm feeling that particular day or even that particular hour. Whether my needs right then are I need help physically standing up or moving around, or if I'm not in a flare-up or having severe symptoms, I may just need someone to talk to and kind of let some of my emotions out and have that sounding board. I also need to recognize, though, that can take a toll on him and make sure that I'm there and acknowledging his feelings about everything. What I've also found is that having a really good support system helps us maintain our identity. What one person needs compared to another person in terms of support can be very different. But having someone who's known you and knows you as the person that you are, not, Rhonda who has adult onset Still's disease. That is Rhonda who is my sister, my cousin, my friend, my coworker who happens to have adult onset Still's disease. And a lot of those first interactions that we have after we get our diagnosis are with our loved ones. So while it's important to acknowledge that your loved one does have an invisible illness, we also still want to be ourselves. We want to be recognized as the people we are and not let that chronic illness define us. That's where this article ended, and so I did want to go back and reflect on a few things. I did also briefly refer to another article that I'll also link in the description. So any sources that I used, I'll make sure that I link them in the description as my sources. But what I've said earlier was I want to recognize too that we're all individuals. Something that I've noticed in my research is there have been articles about how a loved one might be able to help us manage our illness, and the articles would state things that our loved ones should always say to us to show support and things that they should never say. But I'd read another article and some of the items that were on the never say list on the first article was on the always say list on the next article. And myself just reading through those expectations of what should and should not be said. I'm looking under, things that someone should always say to someone with a chronic or rare illness. And I'm thinking, no, I wouldn't appreciate that if someone said that to me. And on the reverse, again, saying that this is something you should never say, but me looking at it and taking no offense to it. So, yes, I do refer to articles during my podcast a lot, and probably as I get more comfortable with doing a podcast and even more comfortable and more confident in myself, I might be able to get past using an article for much of the podcast. But it is interesting in finding out what researchers, medical professionals, what they think as compared to those who are actually going through the illness. And what I don't see in many of these articles is the recognition that we are individual and that we really need to recognize that different situations and experiences lead to different reactions and expectations, just in life in general, but also when you have an illness that's hard to explain and hard to define. So I don't like this, one size fits all approach where, just reading, one article will say this is what everybody who has an invisible illness or a chronic illness needs, and this is what they don't need. I really want people to understand that an individual's needs always need to be looked at. And while there may be some things that, are more widespread or can be more of a blanket statement for most people, I myself don't like using universal terms such as all, never, everyone, or no one. That leaves no room for exceptions. And I think there really needs to be, because even just recently with something, not even related to my illness, but personally, the way that I interpreted something was completely different in a way that someone else interpreted it. And, I can at times, I admit, I can be a rather sensitive person. And, just, going through that experience, it did make me recognize that, okay, if someone else is looking at this in a different way, I'm sorry that may have hurt someone, but that does show then that individuality needs to be respected and supported. But that does kind of lead me to the last thing I want to talk about. It was discussed briefly in the article, but what I'm going to express now is more of my opinion and how I really look at things on a daily basis. And that's, not giving up, to recognize that, with an illness that we have, right now, there may not be a cure or a treatment. With what I have, the first FDA-approved treatment came out in 2020. And it was the use of a medication that was already on the market for the adult onset Still's disease. However, different patients react in different ways, so that one medication may not necessarily be the best fit for everyone. But the fact that this illness was diagnosed around 100 years ago for the first time, and just now it has its first treatment, it provides hope, but at the same time I want to act upon that. There's some momentum, and we need to keep that momentum going. Having diseases or illnesses that are classified as orphan, having something as important as an FDA-approved treatment gets me very excited about the fact that research is still being done, that researchers recognize that even though this particular illness may not affect a large number of people, it does affect people and their loved ones, and it deserves to be researched. There needs to be a treatment that those who have the illness can turn to. So as we're on our journey with this illness, learning how to live with it, finding out new things about it. We cannot give up by thinking, well, there's no treatment for it or there's no cure. What we need to try to look at is, research that is being done, and not to let go of the idea that one day there will be a cure or a treatment or a way to even prevent anyone from ever having the illness. At times that may seem impossible, but if we let go of that, then it will be impossible. There will be no one there to, back or support those researchers who are trying to find the cure. So while we need to be realist and set, the correct expectations, we also need to strive to go forward so that there will be a time where someone who receives our diagnosis will know that it can be treated. I hope that this is done within my lifetime, because there have been so many medical advances, just in my lifetime alone. But I also know that it may not be. But I want to do what I can to try to, strive towards that cure. So just, some of the choices I've made, such as I did do like a health DNA test to try to see if there were certain things that might contribute towards my disease. Because it is such a rare one, though, I know that there's not going to be a lot of information unless more people with my illness actually, go in and do those health DNA kits. So even though there's not really anybody else in there right now, at least with the kit that I took, as time goes by, more and more people may actually start to do that, and that could help provide a base for providing information to researchers. When I still was in the hospital after I was initially diagnosed, one of the doctors came and he wanted to document certain things, and he wanted to take pictures. And I know that's a very personal experience, especially when I definitely was not looking my best. I looked horrible. I was even at the point where I didn't want my children to see me because I was afraid that they may be scared. But I did let the doctor take the picture, because even if that helped him or a colleague or anyone, come up with a diagnosis earlier, I'm all for that, because I want to help anybody who, has my particular illness, since I can give specifics on that. But then also as a community, if there are things that, researchers can isolate to figure out why some people get a certain illness and others don't. I really strive for that, and I understand that right now we're not there with my particular illness. I know a lot of things have been sidetracked by COVID-19, and I'm very much a realist about that as well. That was something no one could have ever expected, and it was something that needed to be acted upon quickly. So, again, I'm being a realist in that I understand, during this past year, there may not have been as many medical advances regarding my particular illness, but I hope that someday there will be. With my sister having an autoinflammatory disease, and as I have one as well, there's not technically proof that it runs in families, but at the same time, I do know other people where siblings have different autoinflammatory or autoimmune diseases. So, I just really hope that whether it's, in the near future or just further down the line, that, medical researchers keep it up and, keep researching about these orphan diseases so that there can be a cure someday. I know this last section was a little long, actually longer than I intended it to be, but I really think it's important that we don't give up hope. That will also help with our emotional health, our mental health, by, keeping those positive attitudes. So with that, I'll end today's topic, of how we can go about combating or facing the challenges that we have daily. I will also put any of my contact information in the description of the podcast. Probably email and Facebook are the best ways of getting in touch with me. I have a Facebook page as well as Instagram, which I'm still getting used to, so I don't use it as often. And I check my email on a regular basis. I do have them in the description though, because of availability. I couldn't get the exact same wording or spelling for each username, so just be sure to click the link in there if you do want to contact me. I'd be very interested in any ideas that you may have for future episodes. As I mentioned earlier, I did have a little bit of an issue with a piece of equipment that I have, so I do definitely want to get some interviews going. I have a couple already set up, just I need to make sure that I can have access to record both sides of the conversation before I go forward. So hopefully those will be coming out soon. If you want to share the podcast, please, I would really appreciate that, as I do just want to spread a message of support to everyone. So if you know someone who you think might benefit from it, please share it. I will have links to the different podcatchers that I'm available on in the description as well, but it is available on some of the more popular, such as Google, iTunes, Spotify, Amazon, and I do have it on YouTube as well. If you're like me and I always want to have the TV on in the background with some noise, that's when I'm doing something, I usually like to have it on. So I also have a channel where it's basically the podcast that's just playing. So thank you all so much for, again, taking some time out to listen. Oh, and I almost did forget as well. I did have a supplemental episode around, halfway through the last episode and this episode, about a certain struggle that I have with my weight and recognition as well. So I did, add that into the podcast as well as post it to my Facebook page. But I may have another supplemental episode coming out kind of in relation to that too, because I have noticed some things that were mentioned in different articles that I think really need to be addressed, but it's very similar to the topic that I discussed in that episode, and about certain eating disorders. So I'm going to start looking into that. I just saw some of the articles today. So it's something I definitely want to do, because I want to make sure that everybody feels support in all walks and areas of life. So if I can get that done this week, I will. If not, it will come out next week, between next week's podcast and the following one. And I hope to speak with you next week. Until then, please take care of yourself. Be vigilant and doing social distancing, wearing your mask, make sure you're washing your hands. Just stay safe, everyone, and have a good week.